Hello Disney friends, and welcome back to Dole of the Day, a place where we talk Disney. I'm Rebecca, and if you're new or if you're returning, I just want you to know that you are so welcome here, and I am very happy to have you join us. So today kicks off a new segment that I want to add to my channel where I review books that Disney movies are based off of. Most of you don't know, but I am a huge reader. I love books. I always have loved books. I started out in college as an English major. I really wanted to go into publishing, but that just didn't pan out. That's just not where life took me. But if I ever got a chance to go back to school, I would probably go back and do something related to English, writing, publishing, something along those lines. So the book that I picked out to do my first book review is Peter Pan. Guys, I love Peter Pan. It has some of the most whimsical movie moments, and it has fun characters like Tinkerbell. Tinkerbell decided to join us here today. She's going to sit over here while we review the book. But we're going to start with some background about the author of Peter Pan, because I truly believe that, especially in the case of Peter Pan, the author's life and some of characteristics about the author truly are significant to the story. So Peter Pan is written by the author J.M. Barrie. J.M. stands for James Matthew. Keep in mind that his first name is James because that will come into play later. So he was born in 1860 in Scotland, and he was very close with his family. His early childhood was described as very happy and a very loving home. But something really sad happened. When James Matthew Barrie was only 6 years old, his brother was actually killed in a skating accident, and J.M. Barrie witnessed the whole thing. Sadly, J.M. Barrie's mother grieved to the point where she would just lock herself in her house and refuse to go anywhere or talk to anyone. And so J.M. Barrie really felt a burden to help cheer his mother up. So he would go into his mother's room and try to emulate his little brother, try to make his mother laugh in the way that his little brother had done. He really sought to be humorous to make his mother happy. He even would keep tally of how many times he made his mother laugh. So this was something that was super important to him. He really watched this grief process in his mother, and he really loved his mother and wanted to help her, which of course is sweet, but it's also an enormous burden for a young child to carry. J.M. Barrie, unlike Peter Pan, did eventually grow up, and he married. His marriage is described as a pretty loveless marriage. Historians do believe that he and his wife could not have children, and that was a source of a lot of conflict in their marriage. So his marriage did eventually break up. J.M. Barrie did become very close in his adult life to a family called the Davies. They had 5 boys, and he loved to play with the boys and to imagine with them and to watch them when his parents were out. A lot of the stories that he wrote in his lifetime were derived from imaginings that the young boys had and that he observed them having. Eventually, though, both of the parents in the Davies family passed away, and so J.M. Barrie adopted all 5 of the sons. Peter Pan is especially believed to be based very much on the play of these young boys, and the book actually started as a play. A lot of J.M. Barrie's works are actually plays, but the play was so enormously popular that he ended up writing it in book form, and it actually went through several forms before the classic form that we refer to today as being the book Peter Pan. But sadly, there was still tragedy to come in J.M. Barrie's life. So the oldest of the Davies boys was killed in World War I. And not long after that, the youngest of the Davies boys died in a drowning accident. And J.M. Barrie never fully recovered from this. He was never the same. He never was able to publish another work that had the same popularity and notoriety as Peter Pan. So I think that J.M. Barrie's life is very significant when you read Peter Pan, because read in the lens of J.M. Barrie's life, Peter Pan is actually a very sad, very dark book. Think about it. Children who never grow up. And in J.M. Barrie's life, children who never had the chance to grow up because they were lost at a tragically young age. So is the Neverland like an afterlife for children who have passed away and never had the chance to grow up? It's a possibility that that is what J.M. Barrie had in mind. In the book, we see that Jay and Barry did not shy away from death. There is lots of violence in the book. There is lots of talking about killing and dying. And on page 87 of this copy of Peter Pan, Peter is about to die. He's stranded on a rock and he's about to drown. And he says to die will be an awfully big adventure. Neverland is the place where adventures happened. Is Neverland the afterlife? I don't know. What do you think? Another thing that I think is very significant that I discovered in this book was the description of the Darling mother grieving the children when they were gone from their home to Neverland. So I'm going to pull up that quote real quick, because I believe that the way that the Darling mother is described as grieving is probably similar to what Jay and Barry observed in his own mother after his little brother passed away from the skating accident. This is on pages 142 and 143. And the book reads, "On that eventful Thursday week, Mrs. Darling was in a night nursery waiting George's return home, a very sad-eyed woman. Now that we look at her closely and remember the gaiety of her in the old days, all gone now just because she has lost her babes, I find I won't be able to say nasty things about her after all. If she was too fond of her rubbishy children, she couldn't help it. Look at her in her chair, where she has fallen asleep. The corner of her mouth, where one first looks, is almost withered up. Her hand moves restlessly on her breast, as if she had a pain there. Some like Peter best, and some like Wendy best, but I like her best. Suppose, to make her happy, we whisper to her in her sleep that the rats are coming back. They are really within 2 miles of the window now, and flying strong, but all we need whisper is that they are on their way. Let's." Perhaps that was Jay and Barry's wish for his own mother, that he could just say, "My brother is coming back," and everything would be okay again. Another reflection of Jay and Barry's own life that I did notice in the book, although I don't know if it's, on purpose or if it was just the name that he liked the best, but Captain Hook's first name is James, like James Matthew Barry. And some of the things I'm going to talk about later with themes that I've recognized in this book and some theories that I have about the book actually play along with this idea that that was intentional. So now let's talk about Jay and Barry's writing style. I do love Jay and Barry's writing style. It is very whimsical and playful, and it's almost like he is poking fun at adults and poking fun at childhood in a very loving, gentle way as he writes. One of the questions that I have about the book is, are the events in the book meant to be magic, or are they meant to be metaphor? You can never really truly tell, because the way that he writes makes it possible that this never really happened and it was all in the children's heads. But if a child read the book, they would see it as magic. Here's an example here. Mrs. Darling first heard of Peter when she was tidying up her children's minds. It is the nightly custom of every good mother, after her children are asleep, to rummage in their minds and put things straight for the next morning, repackaging their proper places the many articles that have wandered during the day. If you could keep awake, but of course you can't, you would see your own mother doing this, and you would find it very interesting to watch her. It is quite like tidying up drawers. You would see her on her knees, I expect, lingering humorously over some of your contents, wondering where on earth you had picked this thing up, making discoveries sweet or not so sweet, pressing this to her cheek as if it were as nice as a kitten, and hurriedly stowing that out of sight. When you wake up in the morning, the naughtiness and evil passions with which you went to bed have been folded up small and placed at the bottom of your mind, and on the top, beautifully aired, are spread out on your prettier thoughts, ready to put on. It also talks about the Neverland as being different for every child. So is it a real place, or is it a place children go in their imaginations? Who knows? The book says on page 11, our Neverlands vary a good deal. John's, for instance, had a lagoon with flamingos flying over it, at which John was shooting, while Michael, who was very small, had a flamingo with lagoons flying over it. And then it goes on a little bit and says, Neverlands have a family resemblance, and if they stood still in a row, you could say of them that they have each other's nose, and so forth. On these magic shores, children at play are forever beaching their coracles. We too have been there. We can still hear the sound of the surf, though we shall land there no more. And then I think it's a little humorous because it goes on and reads, "Of all delectable islands, the Neverland is the snuggest and most compact, not large and sprawly, you know, with tedious distances between one adventure and another, but nicely crammed. When you play at it by day with the chairs and the tablecloth, it is not in the least alarming, but in the 2 minutes before you go to sleep, it becomes very nearly real. That is why there are night lights." And I think that's so funny because you can remember as a child, you know, telling scary stories, ghost stories to each other, having fun playing at all kinds of wacky adventures, and they're fine and they're all well and fun during the day, but as soon as you cut out the light at night, man, those stories come back to you and keep you awake. So now we get into the part that I think is the most fun. And this is a theory that probably doesn't all add up, but that I think is fun to play around with about Peter Pan and Captain Hook specifically. So I have this theory that Peter Pan and Captain Hook are actually the same mind, the same character, and the same person and at their time in Neverland. And I believe that Hook is the part of Peter that is threatening to grow up, the part of Peter that is wanting to grow up, and so the grown-up part of Peter. So Captain Hook constantly talks in the latter part of the book about his days at Eton. I don't know if it's Eton or Eton. I'm not British, so I'm not positive. But he talks about his days at this famous school and how the thing that stuck with him most about the school was good form. Essentially, being grown up, being a gentleman, being in good form. And so he embodies kind of this maturity, this grown-upness, even in his cruelty, whereas Peter is bad form. Peter is cocky. Peter is reckless. He is everything that is bad form. He is childhood and innocence and immaturity. So one thing you should know about Peter Pan is that he doesn't necessarily like not being able to grow up. He is insistent that he doesn't want to grow up, but we're not entirely convinced that that is what is best for him, is to stay a child forever. Once again, is it talking about death as a child, you know, being not a good thing? Maybe so. But we do hear in the book about Peter having some very troubling dreams, which could be related to his inability to grow up. And here's a description of that on page 115. "Sometimes, though not often, he, Peter, had dreams, and they were more painful than the dreams of the other boys. For hours he could not be separated from these dreams, though he wailed piteously in him." The introduction described this as like the riddle of his existence. The fact that he must go on and on and on and on living, and time must pass, but he can never grow up. Whereas Hook is described as seeing Peter as something entirely different. What stayed Hook was Peter's impertinent appearance as he slept, the open mouth, the drooping arm, the arched knee. They were such a personification of cockiness as, taken together, will never again, one may hope, be presented to eyes so sensitive to their offensiveness. They steeled Hook's heart. If his rage had broken him into 100 pieces, every one of them would have disregarded the incident and leapt at the sleeper. So as the conflict between Hook and Peter goes on, Hook is very offended by Peter's youth and cockiness and joy and recklessness. On page 135, hitherto Hook had thought that he had some fiend fighting him, but darker suspicions assailed him now. "Pan, who and what art thou?" he cried huskily. "I'm youth, I'm joy," Peter answered at a venture. "I'm a little bird that has broken out of the egg." So is Hook the part of Peter's conscience that thinks it needs to grow up and therefore resents his eternal childhood? That's my theory. And of course, spoiler alert, in the end of the story, Peter is the one who is victorious over Hook. But if Hook had been victorious over Peter, would we have seen Peter become free to grow up? That's a good question to ask, I think, because since Peter does win, he of course goes on living as an eternal child, which once again it is made very unclear in the book whether this is a blessing or a curse. In the book, Peter also has one of his terrible, upsetting dreams the night after he kills Hook. It says on page 138, "He had one of his dreams that night, and he cried in his sleep for a long time." Is he crying because he is now cursed still to eternal childhood, whereas if Hook had been victorious and allowed Peter the freedom to grow up, that wouldn't have been the case. If we're going to go along with this theory, then I am going to assume that the part of Peter's consciousness that is Hook, that is growing up, is also afraid at the same time to grow up, because Peter wants to be a boy forever. And I think then that the character of Tick-Tock, the crocodile, becomes very significant, because think about it. This crocodile is the only thing that Captain Hook is afraid of. It is the crocodile that Peter fed Hook's arm to when he got into a conflict with Hook earlier, like before the story started. But the thing is, the crocodile ticks. He ticks like a clock. He has a clock inside him that is constantly ticking. Is that the passage of time that so threatens a child into adulthood? Maybe. Here's a quote from the book about how Hook was afraid of Tick-Tock the crocodile. He's talking to Smee, and he says, "Peter flung my arm," Hook said, wincing, "to a crocodile that happened to be passing by." "I have often," noticed Smee, "noticed your strange dread of crocodiles." "Not of crocodiles," Hook corrected him, "but of that one crocodile." He lowered his voice. "It liked my arm so much, Smee, that it has followed me ever since, from sea to sea and from land to land, licking its lips for the rest of me." "Smee," he said huskily, "that crocodile would have had me before this, but by a lucky chance it swallowed a clock which goes tick, tick inside it. And before it can reach me, I hear the tick and bolt." Is he afraid of the passage of time because that is what would make him grow? Going along with this theory, later in the story, at the scene of the ultimate conflict between Peter and Hook, something very interesting happens. This crocodile stops ticking, and Peter begins doing the ticking himself. I don't know quite what to make of that, but I do think that there's something there to unpack. I want to read you some of the quotes, some of the excerpts that relate to this particular instance. So, on page 127, on page 127, J.M. Barrie writes, "He had seen the crocodile," and he is referring to Peter. "He had seen the crocodile pass by without noticing anything peculiar about it, but by and by he remembered that it had not been ticking anymore. At first he thought this eerie, but soon he concluded rightly that the clock had run down." And then it goes on, and Peter says in the middle of this little narrative here, "As he swam he had but one thought, Hook or me this time." And then it goes on and says, "The crocodile." No sooner did Peter remember it than he heard the ticking. At first he thought the sound did come from the crocodile, and he looked behind him swiftly. Then he realized that he was doing it himself. Is Peter in danger of growing up here? Is he in danger of being defeated by Hook? That's kind of what I'm getting from this part of the story. What are some themes in this book? Well, I think I've already covered some of them. I think that there is the theme that is the question, is eternal childhood a blessing or a curse? And I think that especially when we look at that in light of all of the loss of children that J.M. Barrie had in his life, that becomes a very interesting question. I also think that this book is ultimately a story about the goodness of growing up. Neverland is a dark place. It is a scary place. There are bad things that happen in Neverland. We tend to romanticize Neverland because probably of the magical Disney version of Peter Pan, but really in this book there are threats around every single corner. Childhood is a threatening and vulnerable existence. This is ultimately about the goodness of growing up. There's even a part of the book that says, when talking about Wendy after she had grown up, "Wendy was grown up. You need not be sorry for her. She was one of the kind that likes to grow up. In the end, she grew up of her own free will a day quicker than the other girls." Yet at the same time, in this part of the story, after Wendy has grown up and has a child of her own, we do still see Peter threatened by the reality of aging. So basically, Wendy has grown up, and Peter comes back to visit Wendy and finds that she is now an adult and has a child of her own. And Wendy says to Peter, "I will turn on the light, and then you can see for yourself that she's grown up." For almost the only time in his life that I know of, Peter was afraid. "Don't turn on the light," he said. There's also this theme in the book about kind of the cruelty of childhood. A lot of the things that happen in Neverland are like children wanting to slay each other and other characters in the story. Now, a lot of that is the play of childhood, but what is it about childhood and play that makes children want to play that they're going to like harm others? Because that is something that I, as a kindergarten teacher, I see the kids wanting to play shoot at each other and things like that all the time. It's probably a lack of recognition of the consequences of a lot of this stuff. But J.M. Barrie describes childhood and children as being gay, innocent, and heartless. And as much as I love kids, I do think that is a pretty interesting and maybe accurate description of what kids are like. The story says on page 100, let me see. "When we're children, everything is just as it should be, you see. Off we skip like the most heartless things in the world, which is what children are, but so attractive. And we have an entirely selfish time, and then, when we have need of special attention, we nobly return for it, confident that we shall be rewarded instead of smacked." And finally, in talking about Peter's inability to grow up and his magic and him continuing to visit children as time goes on and these children grow up and have children of their own, the book concludes, "And so it will go on as long as children are gay and innocent and heartless." The end. So, the big question is, do I prefer Disney's version of Peter Pan or do I prefer the book version of Peter Pan? That's a hard question to answer because as a person who loves to read, I always want to say the book is my favorite. And I do think that the book has a depth and a meaning that is not there in the movie. However, if I have something that I want to sit down and enjoy with a child of my own one day, it's going to be the movie version of Peter Pan. I do love the Disney magic of Peter Pan, and I don't think that the book has that same fun innocence. It is instead a lot darker and a lot deeper. So I hope you enjoyed my book review. Yeah, so like I said, this is something a little bit different, but it is one of my passions. I told my mom earlier today, I said, this is actually kind of fun. I feel like I'm in school again. I was one of those nerds that just loved school. So it's kind of fun to have like an assignment to work on for this channel and for these videos. I do plan to do this once a month to review a different book that a Disney movie is based off of. I have 2 options for the month of February. This was like January's book reviewed in February, so I'll review the next book in March, but I'm going to read it for the rest of this month. And those 2 books are either Tarzan of the Apes or The Hunchback of Notre Dame. So please let me know in the comments below which of these 2 books you think I should review next. Let me know what your thoughts are about what I had to say in this video. Let me know your own theories about Peter Pan. Have you read the book? Do you see any of these same things in the Disney movie? Did you enjoy this style of video? Let me know. I hope that you guys are doing great, and I hope that you hang on to the good parts of childhood, but don't be afraid to grow up and to enjoy life as an adult as well. Bye-bye, guys. Take care.